Hello and welcome to Friday Night Arcade. Since WWE is moving Raw to Netflix next week, I thought it would be fun to take a look back at some old school wrestling games from the 80s and 90s. Now I'm talking old games, going all the way back to some of the earliest arcade games, as well as some of the early licensed and unlicensed games on the NES, and some other weird ones that you may have never heard of. This list is in no particular order, and I'm also purposely leaving off Nintendo 64 wrestling games because I feel like that's probably worthy of its own separate video somewhere down the road. Also, if you're a subscriber to the channel, please stick around to the end for a very special message. Anyway, let's get started with what, as far as I can tell, is the earliest wrestling game ever made this week on Friday Night Arcade. Well, when it comes to old wrestling games, this is pretty much as old as it gets. Tag Team Wrestling released in the arcades by Technos Japan in 1983. This got a Japan release as well as a US release by Data East. You play as the good guys, Sonny and Terry, a totally generic babyface tag team wearing identical trunks and boots. The goal is to defeat the even more generic masked bad guy tag team made up of a skinny guy and a fat guy, literally referred to as the heel team in the Japanese version, although in the US version they're called the Mad Maulers. Okay, so that all looks fairly primitive. You can't even choose different teams to play as, and the only type of match available is a tag team match. But there's some good action here, and they had a lot of good ideas. Clearly, the programmers knew a thing or two about how pro wrestling works at least, and for a first stab at making a wrestling game, I can respect what they accomplished with this. Instead of having to learn specific button combinations to execute a special move like you would in, say, Street Fighter 2, you grapple with your opponent using an action button, and then once you get a hold on, you can cycle through a list of moves to execute. You know, such classic wrestling moves as the, nutter. You want to try to pull off a few basic moves in a row to lower your opponent's energy level before you try to hit them with a finishing move. Full disclosure, I did have trouble getting any of the special moves to work, but that was probably more user error on my part than anything, and I probably just needed to practice with it some more. I really like the sound effects of the crowd as well as the crowd animations. I get some Punch-Out vibes with this. I was impressed there was so much movement in the crowd, considering a lot of later wrestling games have static crowds that just look like cardboard cutouts. Crowd interaction is such a big part of pro wrestling, so that just stands out to me as a really big deal that they got that part right. Also, one of the times I got knocked out of the ring, someone just ran in from the crowd and attacked me, although unfortunately I wasn't recording when that happened. You could also pick up random weapons off the ground sometimes, or even lose by countout. Really, this isn't a bad first attempt at a wrestling game at all. Tag Team Wrestling did get ported to several computer systems of the day. There was even a Tag Team Wrestling pinball game. And there was also a very rough version ported to the NES. Sticking with NES games, here's the simply titled Pro Wrestling, developed and released by Nintendo in 1986. This was one of the last in Nintendo's Black Box series in the US and even featured the same startup music as 3 other Black Box games: volleyball, tennis, and baseball. Although there are some conflicting reports as to whether or not this was developed in-house by Nintendo or contracted out to a company called Try, which later became Human Entertainment, the general consensus is that Masato Masuda spearheaded the development of this game, and he was passionate about pro wrestling. He went on to make Fire Pro Wrestling, although this was his first take on the genre. Pro wrestling on the NES was not licensed with any particular company, although most of the characters are clearly paying homage to real-life counterparts. Fighter Hayabusa is based off Antonio Inoki, who was the top star in New Japan Wrestling at the time, and they even modeled his finisher, the back brain kick, off of Inoki's offense. Giant Panther was a nod to the Von Erichs, and his Iron Claw finisher was a move they were well known for. The game's champion, King Slender, was totally based off the Nature Boy Ric Flair, who had many NWA title reigns in that era. The Amazon was based off of, Creature from the Black Lagoon? Hey, that's not fair. He uses a fork to stab you when the ref isn't looking, and it actually shows a little bit of blood. Check it out. Pro wrestling could be played with 1 or 2 players. In single player mode, you played in a circuit with the goal of trying to win enough matches to get yourself ranked number 1 so you could get a title shot against King Slender. Unless, of course, you play as King Slender, then you're going to be facing off against Giant Panther. If you manage to defend your title 10 times in a row, then you face off against the game's true final boss, Great Puma. The game featured several distinct moves that could be pulled off with button combinations. The A button gives you a basic kick while B button throws a punch. If you double tap the arrows left or right, your character will pick up a run that you can use to bounce off the ropes. If you tap the arrow button toward your opponent, you can grapple and from there execute any number of moves by combining any direction on the D-pad and the A or B buttons. You could also counter a move with a well-timed A or B button, although the CPU usually cheated like a bastard, so it was tough to pull off in single-player mode. Since the CPU cheats so much, I don't feel bad about picking up a cheap count-out victory at all. You could throw your opponent out of the ring and even pull off a dive through the ropes. And if you manage to incapacitate your opponent near the turnbuckle, you could climb up and try to hit them from the top rope. This was high risk, high reward though, because if your opponent moves out of the way in time, you actually take damage from the fall. Like I said, they got a lot of the subtle nuances of pro wrestling just right with this game. One thing to note is there is no visible health meter. Instead, there are 2 alarms that go off after a player has taken enough damage. The first alarm lets you know, hey, you're getting kinda low on health and you need to be on your guard. The second alarm is more of an emergency because it means you could be pinned at any time. To go in for a pin after your opponent is down, you'll need to quickly press the A button while you're near your opponent. So yeah, this game is pretty fun in single player mode, but where it really shines is 2-player mode. Having several colorful characters to choose from and too much time on your hands as a little kid would mean you could be constantly sparring with your friends all evening, vying for bragging rights over who gets to be Supreme World Champion of the World. At the time, this was as good as it gets for pro wrestling video games, and clearly the sales records show that. It was the 22nd highest-selling NES game of all time, selling over 2 million copies. The animations on the characters are well done and they're really detailed and oversized. I think it looks really good for the year this came out. There's a decent-sized roster of zany, over-the-top characters to choose from, you've got color commentators sitting at ringside, the ref is constantly following the action, and there's even a camera guy feverishly filming everything. This does a really nice job of capturing the pomp and circumstance of what pro wrestling is all about. I also dig the little bit of music that is included in the game, and the crowd noise is well done too, and this part should sound familiar to fans of Punch-Out! Not to mention, this features one of the most memorable mistranslations of all time. If I had to find something to nitpick about with this game, it's the lack of submission holds. But to be honest, they were able to get so many other things in that I can look past that given the year this came out. This is a well done and very fun game. Next up is Title Match Pro Wrestling on Atari 2600? Wait, what? Okay, so this actually came out quite a bit later in the Atari's lifespan, 1987, but it's kinda neat that they tried at least. And because I lost all of the raw footage I recorded for this game, I'm gonna turn it over to me from like 6 years ago. Nobody saw that episode anyway, so here you go. That's right, there was a pro wrestling game on Atari 2600. This was released in 1987 by the good people at Activision. Although this isn't the earliest pro wrestling game out there, Pro Wrestling came out in 1986 on the NES. This is the most primitive console version of a wrestling game that I could dig up, unless I missed something. There was also a little bit prettier version of Title Match for the Atari 7800, but I'm more interested in the version on 2600. Wrestling games in general require some fairly complex gameplay mechanics, so it intrigued me to see just what exactly they came up with, and I was not disappointed. While the game certainly isn't spectacular or anything, I'm always fascinated by how developers find little ways to push the hardware to its limits. Activision figured out a creative way to utilize the console's select switch here. You can toggle between 4 different game modes: 2-player one-on-one, 2-player tag team, 1-player versus the computer, or a tag team versus the computer's tag team. And there's also 4 different wrestlers to choose from. Hey, that's actually kind of impressive. Let's check out the manual and see what these guys are all about. Mad Dog. This husky redneck vows to chew up and spit out anyone who tries to tangle with
him and Skinhead. That sounds kind of bad. Mr. Mean and Big Chief. Big Chief Pow Wow doesn't miss a trick. Yeah, that's not at all offensive to anybody. Once you get started, it's pro wrestling on the Atari 2600. There's not a whole lot to say about it. The gameplay mechanics aren't half bad though. You can pick guys up or bounce them off the ropes. It's possible to do a dive off the ropes too. Both wrestlers have an energy meter too, and that's fairly complex for the console. Considering all they had to work with was a joystick and a button, there's actually a lot of mechanics to do here. I'm not sure that it all works the way it was intended, but by gosh, they tried. You can even toggle something called Muscle Mode. If you're down or in a bear hug, the manual says to jiggle the joystick left and right very fast to increase your chances of escaping. The manual also encourages you to try to use less taxing moves, such as punches or kicks, to try to conserve energy if you're running low, since bigger moves take more energy. Again, that's a fairly complex energy management system, even if it's clunky as all get out. Also, check out the sounds here. Specifically, check out the crowd noise. It sounds kind of cool, but it also sounds kind of familiar. If you listen closely, it sounds like the spaceship engine from another Activision title, Star Master. It wasn't uncommon for Atari 2600 developers to reuse sound effects across their game library, but it seems like a little bit of an odd choice. When you're slamming your opponent, it sounds like your plane just blew up in River Raid. So is this game worth playing today? Well, obviously, you could do a whole lot better on just about any generation beyond the Atari 2600, but if you're interested at all in the history of it, or just want to see how wrestling games have evolved, give this one a look. It's not much fun beyond the first few minutes or so, especially against the nearly impossible to beat computer, but it could be kind of fun if you had some friends to go up against.
Now let's take a look at some of the officially licensed titles. Let's start with WWF's first NES game, WWF WrestleMania, released in 1989. There's Hulk Hogan right there on the title screen, and you get 6 wrestlers in total to choose from. Most of the familiar names from the time: Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, Andre the Giant. Well, this is basic. Everything about this game is rudimentary at best. You get a pretty limited moveset of punches and kicks and headbutts. There is a top turnbuckle move. There's digitized photos of all the wrestlers on their profile pictures, and those look pretty good for the time, but the actual character sprites are just kind of there. It's okay, it's fine, I guess. You can play 1 or 2 players in a single exhibition match, and there's also an option to play up to 6 players in a tournament mode where you can play 2 players at a time. The AI is wonky and the computer character will just wander around aimlessly sometimes. The music is okay, but not memorable, and there's not even a crowd. I guess Hogan vs. Andre is just taking place in an empty warehouse somewhere.
World Championship Wrestling!
Okay, now this is an improvement. WCW Wrestling on the NES. This came out in 1989 and was miles ahead of any of the official WWF titles at the time. It's not perfect, but it gets a lot of things right. In single-player mode, you can make your way through all of the other wrestlers on the roster to eventually face the champion, and if you win, you take home the belt. There's up to 12 wrestlers to choose from. These were all late 80s WCW stars such as Flair, Sting, Ricky Steamboat, or either of the Road Warriors. The graphics are really solid for an NES game, and the wrestler sprites are impressive for the time. I also really like what they did with the crowd, and even though it feels primitive by today's standards, this was really cool how animated and alive the stadium feels. The sound effects are all really solid, and they even digitized a few voices.
1, 2, 3! Yeah!
You can also get thrown out of the ring, and when that happens, the game changes perspective. This is really cool, check this out. It even continues to change the viewing angle depending on what side of the ring you're on, and sometimes a fan will just randomly chuck a wrench out there that you can grab. That's just fantastic. The movesets aren't 100% accurate, but at least they tried. The A and B buttons will punch and kick. Pressing B in any direction on the D-pad will execute a basic wrestling move like a hammer throw or a headbutt, and pressing A in any direction on the D-pad will execute one of your favorite moves. You get to pick up to 4 favorite moves before each match, and they're tailored to whichever wrestler you pick, which is pretty detailed for 1989. They really put some thought into this. I will say that the AI is pretty relentless, and it will be tempting to just start mashing buttons, but you really need to understand how the game's move system works to have any success in single-player mode. You may just want to practice in 2-player mode by yourself just to get the hang of it. Oh, and the game has a tag team wrestler mode as well. Your tag partner is invisible until you actually tag them in the corner. This is probably due to system limitations, but it's cool that they at least have a tag team mode. Also, I really like the music for this game. It's very well done. This is easily one of the best wrestling games on the NES.
1, 2, 3. Yeah.
WWF WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge. This one's an LJN joint, so you know it should be good. Well, it's got a decent-sized roster, which includes Hulk Hogan, Undertaker, Bret Hart, Savage, Jake the Snake, Sid Justice, and the Mountie. The combat is stiff and kinda clunky. The animations are okay, but they're a little herky-jerky. The sound effects are pretty harsh on the ears. Everybody gets the same basic loadout of generic wrestling moves, and there's no character-specific finishers. But hey, it's got a cage match, and that's probably the biggest selling point, or at least it would have been for the time. Now you've got more wrestlers to choose from, and you can face off in a big steel cage. This was probably fun as a rental at the time if you had some friends to sit down and play with on a weekend, but it's definitely one of those older games that just doesn't age well. So I really can't recommend this one except for the most curious or wrestling-obsessed players who just want to see what it was like. Well, okay, this is something completely unexpected. Micro League Wrestling. This is a licensed WWF computer game that came out on the Amiga, the Commodore 64, along with the Atari ST and DOS. It was developed by Micro League, which, as far as I can tell, just made a handful of sports titles around that time and then went bankrupt. They were one of the first developers to ever produce an officially licensed MLB baseball game, though. Micro League Wrestling takes pro wrestling and WWF superstars from the time and turns it into kind of a turn-based RPG. The baseline game came with 1 match per disc, and then there were expansion discs to add a few more different matchups. You've got digitized chunky footage and images from WWF matches, and then you can pick which move you want to do next from a list of moves. Both players select a move, and then there's some sort of dice roll that happens in the background as to who was successful, and then you repeat the process until someone's energy is depleted enough to go for a finisher. There's even written announcer commentary from Vince McMahon and either Jesse the Body Ventura or Bruno Sammartino. You get some little cutscenes before the match with each guy cutting a promo, and they've even got Fink on the introductions. That's cool. So, this isn't exactly a game, you just play out your turns and see who wins the match. If you try to use your finisher too soon, it usually won't work, so there is some strategy, I guess. You want to start off with some of the easier moves to wear your opponent down before moving into some of the heavier hitting moves. When you do your finisher, you'll automatically try for a pinfall, and then it's up to the computer whether or not there's a kickout. I'd be curious to know if you ever actually played this one. I had no idea this existed. Switching gears back to the arcades, WWF Superstars, developed by Technos Japan and released in 1989. This is a much more traditional arcade button masher. You can play up to 2 players, either on the same team or against each other. The only game mode is a tag team match with 6 wrestlers to choose from. Hogan, Warrior, Hacksaw, Honky Tonk, the usual. All the moves are pretty spot on, although the ring is the size of a Walmart for some reason. It's not super in-depth, but if you win 3 tag matches in a row, you get to face off against the Megabucks, Andre the Giant and $1 Million Man for the tag team titles. Big, chunky, beautiful graphics all look like their real-life counterparts, and the game sounds really nice, even if some of the voices are just bad impressions. Overall, this is simple, but really fun.
I can't wait for the rematch.
It's
time to fight with a powerful challenge.
We snack on danger, dine on death.
To bury every turtle-faced geek we've fed.
Yeah!
Technos Japan followed up on WWF Superstars with WWF WrestleFest in 1991, and this takes everything that was good about the first game and just turns the volume up on it completely. Even bigger, better, and more cartoony over-the-top graphics, improved music, sound effects, and voices, which includes some actual commentary during the match. There's also a much bigger roster of wrestlers to choose from this time around, and it all combines to make an intoxicating arcade button-mashing experience. You could even play with up to 4 players this time around, and the game actually features 2 game modes. There's Saturday night's main event, which is a repeat of the tag team tournament from the first game. If you win 3 tag matches in a row, you get to face off against Legion of Doom for the tag titles. And then there's a Royal Rumble mode. You'll pick one player and take him through a Rumble-style match. The goal here is to throw your opponent over the top rope before they throw you over, or you can also pin them. There's a lot to love about this game. In tag matches, you can pull off some double team moves. Also, if you take enough damage, your character will be kind of dazed and holding his ribs a bit, moving around all slow. You'll want to tag in your partner if you can. The difficulty level feels just right. It's challenging, but not stupidly so. But they did still add a subtle way to gobble up your quarters. You can add quarters for more credits, sure, but you can also use credits to refill your energy meter at any time. And like the first game, your energy doesn't regenerate between matches, so that's kinda cheeky, but seriously, this game is just a ton of fun. If you love old school wrestling and arcade fighting, definitely find a way to seek this one out any way you can. This would be insanely entertaining with a big group of friends.
Climb down the top rope. Leg drop.
1, 2, 3.
Hogan is the king of Royal Rumble.
This game was so fondly remembered that THQ released a remake of the game on iOS in 2012. It featured the same style of gameplay and graphics, but with a greatly expanded roster, including wrestlers from the modern era as well as legends from the past. It's too bad this was never released on a console to my knowledge. You would have had an iPad or an iPhone in order to play it. Rounding out the WWF arcade games from the 90s, it's WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. Rolls right off the tongue. This time Midway picked up the license for the WWF, and, well, here you go. It's Mortal Kombat meets WWF. There's even some over-the-top damage animations like bones flying out when you hit a high-impact move. All you need is the bloody, over-the-top finishers. Maybe HBK could have popped the guy's head off with a super kick. I don't know. So this game, doesn't really work for me, and feels like a step backwards after WrestleFest. On the one hand, the graphics and sounds are certainly far more advanced than their predecessors. They even used similar video digitization techniques that they used in Mortal Kombat, bringing in the wrestlers themselves to try to get a lifelike representation in the game. That's all well and good, and there's more commentary, this time with Vince McMahon and Jerry Lawler at ringside, but the actual gameplay leaves something to be desired. It's trying to be a wrestling game and a fighting game, and it's not especially good at either. I think part of the problem is the combat is definitely based on the classic Mortal Kombat 2D style of fighting, but with the ring, you've still got a bit of 3D movement available. You can move up or down and not just side to side. That makes it tough to get lined up to pull off one of your special attacks, and unless you're both occupying the same horizontal space, you're just going to be swinging at air, which is annoying. Also, a lot of the moves just aren't moves you're going to see in a proper wrestling match. That uppercut is straight out of Mortal Kombat. They even made the matches all 2 out of 3 falls, so it lines up more with how every Mortal Kombat fight was best 2 out of 3 rounds. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sure, WrestleFest was over the top and cartoony, but the actual moves and grappling were still based on wrestling. Combine all of that with a roster that's not all that great. 1995 WWF had some good guys with Razor Ramon, Undertaker, Bret Hart, and HBK, but there was no Rock yet, or Stone Cold, or Mankind. You're stuck with the likes of Doink the Clown. Remember when Doink challenged the Hitman for the IC title in a 5-star classic? Yeah, me neither. I don't know. This one's a hard pass for me. What did you think? Getting back to the NES and getting away from officially licensed titles, try to check out Toucan Club if you can. So, this was a Famicom exclusive that was developed by Natsume and released by Jaleco in 1992. Again, this was never released outside of Japan. I'm playing this using an English translation patch I found on romhacking.net. So, the characters all look like they just came out of River City Ransom. The sound effects have that wacky NES 8-bit charm to them when you pull off a wrestling move, and most mind-blowingly, the camera angle actually rotates as you move around the ring. Can you believe that? This is incredible for the system and the time, and the music is also really epic and well done. There's not a lot to the game, just one-on-one matches, no tournaments, cages, or tag team matches or anything like that, but holy crap, this is still really neat for the time. Definitely try to find a way to play this one if you're into old wrestling games. Tecmo World Wrestling, released on the NES in 1989. This is another fantastic 8-bit wrestling game and quite possibly the best on the console. You've got 10 colorful characters to choose from, each with their own various strengths, weaknesses, and distinct gimmicks. The sprites are big and chunky looking, and the controls are fairly crisp. You've got basic punches and kicks, but then if you move in closer, you can grapple by combining either the A or the B button with the direction on the D-pad. And from there, you can pull from a deeper repertoire of wrestling moves such as suplexes, scoop slams, pile drivers, and so forth. You can also pull off submission maneuvers such as the Scorpion Deathlock. You can even go up to the top rope, although be careful with this because if you miss, you're going to take damage yourself. That's the thing, there's a lot of attention to detail and nuance here as to how a basic wrestling match unfolds, and you don't just want to go immediately into taking high risks. You need to work up to it with some basic offense first. Another neat thing about this game is the commentary. So, there's no voice track, obviously, but the entire match you'll see commentator Tom Talker popping up at the bottom of the screen with a never-ending barrage of play-by-play and quips. Granted, it's going by so fast and you're going to be paying attention to the in-ring action most of the time, so you may miss some of it, but it's usually pretty accurate as to what's going on, and it's impressive that they took the time to do that. Also, some of the times it's just hilarious. He slithered out of the Cobra's hold, the fanatical back brain kick, the pile driver, it's doomsday for the skull. Another neat addition is the training segments. Before each match, you can pick a random training minigame to try and build up your character. And there's a funny little animation that goes along with it. Basically, you just tap the A button as quickly as possible, and if you've got a turbo controller, you could potentially get 2 additional power units in a single training segment. The more power your character has, the more damage they can inflict. However, if you lose a match, you'll lose 1 power bar, so be careful. Also, as you get deeper into the match, if you manage to pull off a high impact move at a critical moment, the game will actually switch to a really cool cutscene showing you a very detailed look at the action. This is just fantastic. It was totally unnecessary, but the fact that they even did it really adds to the overall presentation and just makes the game that much more of a standout. Overall, Tecmo World Wrestling is a must-play for any fan of older wrestling games, and I can't recommend it enough. Just awesome. If you've been a subscriber to this channel over the years, I also just wanted to reach out and say thank you so much for watching the show. I know I've not been able to produce as many new episodes since the twins were born as we all would have liked, and hopefully that'll change when my kids get into kindergarten next fall. Side note, I can't believe they're that old already. But I just want to say thank you so much to everyone that reached out when I released a couple episodes earlier this year after taking a bit of a mental health hiatus. I can't tell you how much that meant to see all of the kind words from everyone pouring in. Also, Friday Night Arcade just recently passed 10 years on YouTube. That's crazy to think about, that I've been doing this for 10 years. And I just want to thank everyone that's been watching, whether you just found the channel recently, or I know some of you have been around since nearly the beginning. Thank you so much. This is just awesome and so much fun to do, and I appreciate everyone that's ever dropped a kind word about the show over the years. It really means a lot. I can't express that enough. Just thank you so much. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know that I'm definitely not dead, I'm not going anywhere, and here's to the next 10 years of Friday Night Arcade. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and I hope you've had a wonderful holiday as well as a Happy New Year. Thank you.
What do you get when you combine Street Fighter II with old school WWF, but without actually having a license to use WWF characters? You get Saturday Night Slam Masters for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, developed and released by Capcom in 1993, or as it was called in Japan,
Muscle Bomber, the Body Explosion.
Well, okay, so this actually started off in the arcades and then was ported to the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Focusing on the Super Nintendo version, this looks like a wrestling game but feels an awful lot like Street Fighter 2. That's totally not Hulk Hogan on the opening cutscene. You have a colorful cast of fighters, wrestlers, to choose from, such as Gunlock, El Stingray, or Biff Slamkovich. That's just awesome.
Big, McLarge, huge.
And is that Hagar from Final Fight? Each one has their own strengths and weaknesses that you would expect based on size and speed. I have to applaud the look of this game, and it has those nice 16-bit graphics and sound you've come to expect from Capcom's Super Nintendo library. Someday I should do a video all about Capcom on the Super Nintendo. Anyway, every track isn't necessarily a winner, but most of the music is solid and certainly reminiscent of some of those memorable Street Fighter II tunes. I guess that should come as no surprise though, since the lead composer was Setsuo Yamamoto, who also put together the music for so many other great Capcom games like Mega Man X and of course Street Fighter II. Graphic-wise, the detailed sprites of these over-the-top colorful characters are well done and easy on the eyes. I also like the attention to detail that went into the overall aesthetic of the game. Little things, like the ring bounces a bit when guys jump up and down, and there's a camera guy lurking ringside, you've got laser light intros, and the excited crowd animations are as good as you could ask for with the Super Nintendo's capabilities. It certainly looks like a wrestling game should. Unfortunately, the similarities to wrestling end there as the game actually plays more like a fighting game. There are special moves, but honestly I had a hard time pulling most of them off, save for maybe tossing a guy off the ropes a few times. Most of your offense seems to come from punching and kicking, and wrestling matches have a way of being reduced to slap fests until your life bar is low enough to go for a pin. That's really the only thing that qualifies as a wrestling mechanic here. When your opponent's life bar gets down to 0, instead of just being declared the winner, you have to go in for a pinfall, so at least they got that right. Players also taunt each other before and after matches, and the taunts are funny but go by too fast to read for some reason. If you lose, you have the option to continue, but if you just let the timer run out, I guess your character just dies. Blah! The SNES version has 2 modes, singles matches where you fight your way through the circuit of fighters one-on-one, or a team battle royale mode where you team up with a partner, computer controlled, or a friend, then battle your way through a circuit of other tag teams. This doesn't play like a traditional tag team match though, and instead everybody is legal and you all fight at once. If one person gets pinned, the match becomes 2-on-1 and continues in real time. This was actually my favorite way to play. As it can make for a frantic race to save your teammate at the last second if they're getting pinned. This game also supports multi-taps, so you could theoretically have up to 4 players playing against each other, and I think that's really where this game shines. The single player mode is easy and frankly a little boring, but it would be an absolute blast with a multi-tap and having 4 friends rumbling against each other and talking smack in the team battle royale mode for hours on end. Unfortunately, there are no other wrestling modes like cage matches or ladder matches, although the Sega Genesis version has something called a death match. The ring is surrounded in barbed wire and you can only play against a human opponent for some reason. You can throw your opponent into the barbed wire and then it explodes. Haha, take that! Not sure why they left this off the SNES version, other than maybe Nintendo thought it was too violent. Players are still bloody sometimes on the character screens though. This was right around the same time Nintendo caved and let them release Mortal Kombat 2 uncensored in 1993, so who knows?
These days, Saturday Night Slam Masters tends to go for somewhere between 20 and 40 bucks as a loose cartridge on either the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis, and it's definitely worth seeking out if you're a fan of these types of games. It's certainly not a perfect wrestling game, or a perfect fighting game for that matter, but what it lacks in depth it makes up for in graphics, humor, and overall just silly fun. Especially if you've got a 4-player multi-tap. Get a multi-tap, invite some friends over for a few beers, and it should be an awesome night.
He's gone.
I heard you were dead.
I am. Roger, they think I'm dead. I'm a corpse. Aren't you dead?
Bio readouts are all on the green. Looks like she's alive.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
Spock's body lives.
There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
Where am I? I knew you had it in you. Reckon it is time. How long was I out?
What day is it? The date?
It's in there, Rick.
What year?
I hope. Chance.
Mr. Miyagi,
This has to get done. You understand me? It has to.
Cannot, must not. It's okay lose to opponent. Must not lose to fear.
I'm afraid!
All I did was refuse to give into it and do what I knew had to be done.
Now get up.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done.
Failure is not an option. We will not go quietly into the night. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. You can't give up. You gotta stand right up. You gotta run to a window and say, "Hey, these floors are dirty as hell, and I'm not gonna take it anymore."
He's alive! The Doc's alive!
I'm back.
Clearly one of the great comebacks since Burt Reynolds' hairline.
We're back, baby! He's a menace to the entire city!
But I'm back. I'm back from the future.
Jordan for the win! Yes! I did it again! He is now back! For the beat!
I thought I'd lost you, boy.
We're just glad he's getting back on the court.
I'm not leaving.
And I will never retire! The show goes on! Stone Cold is back! I will only retire when I'm dead in this ring! Oh my God, what a night! What a night! This is my home! Forever! Forever! 'Cause I ain't going nowhere! I love this business! I'm going nowhere! Thank you! Woo! This is a moment! Feel it! Look at it! Experience it!
Many happy returns.
You ready?
Yes, Michael, I am. And Michael, thanks.
Piece of cake.